Hey guys, welcome to another tutorial. We're going to recreate the enhanced word cloud with all the neon type stuff. We're doing this in Fusion Studio and I'm starting with the text plus node, which I will resize to 800 by 800 because bigger is not always better. That was a bad pun. So once there, I'm changing the font to Corbel. And I'm just popping in some placeholder text. And now it's important to start with something that would represent the largest string you're going to use in your composition. And based on that, you can then adjust the size to the optimal size. Right? So you need to ensure that it doesn't exceed the canvas. So in my case, it will be something like this. So I can increase it a bit to something like 0.10, 11, something like that. Now, rather than basically typing the text in, I'm going to drive it by an expression, which I prepared in Notepad. So it's basically a multi-statement expression where I define an array and that opens with a curly bracket and a number of strings within apostrophes and then separated by commas. And then I end it with a curly bracket, semicolon, and then define the index, which is basically based on the time, the frame, plus 1. And then I return the element of the array corresponding to that index. So for frame 0, it would be 1, etc. So I'll copy this over into my expression and let's take it from there. So let's look at the first frame, rewind, and we see our first string appear. And as we move on, we see the other one, so it's all working. Let's go to the next step. So let's change the background here a bit because we want to have a sort of a semi-transparent plane, but not completely. So I'm just changing that into a bit of a gray color, like so, but actually it's too much. So let me enter the values manually. Let's set it to something really low, 0.1 for the color and 0.25 for transparency. And that looks good. So then onto the shading elements. I'm enabling the second one, the red outline, and I change that to white because I don't want a red outline. And I increase the thickness. And then I add some softness so that we get a nice little glow going. And you can of course do this in multiple ways, but I like to do that in this way. There we go. So on to the next thing, the proper rim around it, I suppose. So we do that with a background node. And we set that to 800 by 800 as with the text plus node. And then give that a bit of a gray background, a bit more. And let's set that to 0.6 for the alpha. So that's looking good. Now as for the edge, right, we want just the outside. So let's set it to 1 by 1 for width and height and untick the solid box and add the border width. And there we go, a very faint rim of the glass. Okay, and then as to combine the two, pipe it in there and it creates our merge. So now we've got a gray paint, but we want to of course have some color. So let's add a color corrector. Now let's have a little play. And as you move this around, you can see the different colors. You can see how it affects things. I don't want it to be too strong, maybe the strength at around 0.3 or 0.4. And instead of manually keyframing the tints, right, let's add a modifier. So right click, modify with, and then shake. So when we play this, we can see the color is changing, but there's two issues. There are two issues. One, it doesn't completely go into all quadrants, right? The red is sort of omitted. And two, it's a bit too slow to be able to give the different strings a really different color. So let's go to the modifier tab and reduce the smoothness so it will get more jerky. So it will change color faster. And then let's increase the max as well. And now we can see that for each string we've got a different color. So that will do for now. All right, let's move on to the next thing, and that's the particle system. So we'll start with a particle emitter and then directly after that a particle render node. They go hand in hand. In the particle emitter, we'll change the style to bitmap and then the animate to particle birth time. And then we can pipe in our color corrector, all our text stuff into the particle emitter. And then when we sort of navigate around a bit, in the viewport you see an issue, it's always facing the camera. So let's untick that in the rotation section. Right, that's looking better. Now we want to change the lifespan to 600, the length of our animation, maybe different for you. And let's go back to the first frame and see what's happening, right? It's all building up, so that's all good. So it gets to frame 10, words have been exhausted, but then afterwards, particles are still being emitted. We don't want that. We want them to stop emitting once the last word has been generated. So let's add a little expression, if with double I, open brackets, time smaller than 10, then comma 55, otherwise none, comma 0. So if it's smaller than 10, then generate 55 particles, otherwise 0. So that means we'll have 50 times each word. Okay, and you can see that's working fine. All right, so the next thing we want to tackle is the region tab, because we want that to be larger substantially. So let's play around with it a bit. Let's drastically increase the width to maybe something like 2. And of course, with that, a bit more height and depth as well. And maybe a bit more, and maybe a bit more width here. And that's looking good. Now, relative to the size of our region now, the particles are a bit small. Let's change the particle size here in the particle style tab, and let's increase that a bit to something like this, and let's click that away, and let's introduce a bit of variance as well, and that's looking pretty good. So I think that's it for now for the basic particle stuff, and then we get into the really interesting particle custom stuff, p-custom stuff. Right, so let's add in a p-custom node. So once added in, let's go to the fifth tab, the particle tab. And by the way, you can change the size of the particles here as well. Lots of things you can change, but for now I'll leave that as is, and I'm moving to the X rotation. So these by default are all at 0, X, Y, and Z. But let's change the X to 45, that's angling. Actually, let's do it minus 90, and then we can see it from the top. So that's a position I like, so I'm recording that. Minus 90, 0, 0, because the other ones were at the default. So I'm just change that right now to reflect that. And let's go back to the Y rotation. Let's set that to 90, and there we go. That's another position I like. And let's try minus 90, and that's a third position. So the rest at 0 and the Y at minus 90. So let's move on to the Z. So set Y to 0, and let's look at Z. And yeah, that's another cool one, minus 90. And now we can even combine things. So if we set the X rotation now to minus 90, and we keep the rotation Z at minus 90 as well, then we get another nice angle. So I'm keeping that. And finally, 90 and minus 90. So I'm recording all these positions. I've got 6 in total, but I want to reserve a couple of numbers for the default 0, 0, 0 position. And you'll see the relevance of that later on. Now I'm going to use the mass parameter because it's unused in the particle system. So I'm using that, or app using that if you will, with a little formula to generate random numbers between 0 and 8, so 1 to 8 really, based on the ID, the particle ID, right? So each particle will be assigned a random number. And then based on that random number, I will set then the rotation, right? And I'll do that in accordance with the table we just created. So for the first one, if single I in the p-custom tool, mass equals 0, have minus 90, otherwise 0. So that equates to the first position, so we're done with that. Now let's do the second one, right? If mass equals 2, right? Set that one to 90, otherwise 0. Again, now we start seeing this sort of variation happening. And let's skip one and let's go to the fourth one. If mass equals 4 in the rotation set, then have it as minus 90, otherwise 0. Again, now we've got 3 positions. So for the third, well, for position 3, the fourth position, we're going to use a nested if. So if it's 2, then 90, otherwise if it's 3, it's minus 90 and otherwise 0. So that is looking good, right? If we rotate it around a bit, we see that, yeah, like that no entry one is conforming to that position. Now, as for position 5, right, we've got two elements, the X rotation and Z rotation. For the X rotation, we can add an OR statement. So if mass equals 1 or mass equals 5, then it needs to be a rotation of minus 90. Right? So then it doesn't matter if it's 1 or 5, it will yield the same result. Now the other part, right, then we need to look at rotation Z, and a similar thing would happen there. So really, if the mass equals 4, we already had that, or if the mass equals 5, or even going ahead with position 6, if it equals if it equals 6, then in those three cases it will yield minus 90, otherwise 0. Okay, so that's then 5 and 6 nearly done. For 6 though, for the X we need to change something as well, and we need to do a nested if there. So if it's not 1 or 5, then if it's 6, then it becomes 90, otherwise 0. And then really we're done with the 6 positions. So that is looking good. And of course, if the mass yields 7 or 8, it will conform to the default position. And that's no rotation, or a rotation of 0 for X, Y, and Z. Right? So I did 7 and 8 because I want that to be more prevalent. So it's more likely that it will be 7 or 8 compared to 1 or 2. Right? It's twice as likely. Now the last thing we want to do in the P custom is to get a flickering type result. So let's save this first, and let's use the alpha parameter for that. I'm going to insert a noise2 function, which is basically a Perlin based noise. I'm using the particle ID as an input, so it will be unique for each particle. And then for the second one, time. And when I play that, it goes absolutely mental. So I want to slow it down a bit, and I can do that by basically dividing the time after I noticed I need to set the transparency there to accurate to have a better view. Divide it by 10. And now I get it's a bit less mental. But it goes off completely, and I want to restrict it for the alpha to be at least 0.7. So I can basically surround the whole thing by a max function that takes the max of the outcome of the noise 2 and 0.7. So it will always be at least 0.7. Now when I play that, nothing happens. So that means that the noise2 function doesn't generate anything that is over 0.7. So let's multiply that by 5. And there we go, flickering panes. So of course you can change the parameters to your liking, faster, slower, etc. But I'll leave that to you guys. So next part of the tutorial, let's go into the merge 3D node and let's add a camera. Now I will proceed this by saying that I will not replicate all the camera movements because that takes too long. So I'll just do some basic movements to give the idea. So in the camera node itself, well, let's actually display everything properly. Let's display the merge also in viewport 1, and let's ensure that's set to camera so that we can see what the camera is seeing. Now in viewport 2, let's ensure I select the camera and then move the camera out a bit so that we can see the whole cloud, or at least the largest part of the cloud. So that will be our starting position. Right, so that will be at around the 5 dot something mark. And let's tilt it a tiny bit down. And then based on that, I'll just increase the Y translation as well. And let's bring this back to the start of the composition. And the render start, as I said before, is set at 10 because I don't want to render the first 10 frames when the text or the particles are being built up. Right, so let's now set keyframes by animating the translation and rotation groups. And let's play around. Let's set it to frame 90 and let's basically animate the camera. Let's pull it in to the cloud to a position you like. As said, I'm not going to go all fancy right now because that takes a long time to get a camera movement right, and I don't want to bore you guys with that. So I think that is a pretty good position to, well, not end with, but for our first part of the camera movement. Now, I want that camera to rotate to the left, but I want it to take a bit of time, not abruptly. But also, I don't want that to take for the whole 2 or 3 seconds. So if we look at it now, if I set a keyframe for Y and play it, it looks weird, right? So instead, I'll undo that. Right, and then basically what I'll do, I'll pull it back by maybe something like from frame 90, right, where our Z translation ends. I pull it back to 70, and there I put a keyframe for 0, basically for the Y rotation. So up until 70 it will be 0, and then in 20 frames it will change to some 90. And now you have a more, still quite fast, but a more gradual and not abrupt change. There we go, like that. And basically, the whole thing now is basically you need to find a nice camera movement. Right? And also, we can play a bit with the in the spline tab and do some easing in and easing out if you want. Right? So we hit the little button on the left, the curved button. Right? It slows down a bit. And it all looks a bit better. But rather than taking you through the whole movement here, I'll speed up the video a bit. And again, you know, choose some nice camera positions. This is just for illustration purposes. It's definitely not the best camera movement ever. But if you encounter certain things like, okay, now the text is mirrored and I don't want to see mirrored text, that all has to do with these different positions we worked on in our P custom tool. So you can include or exclude positions, right, to your liking. For instance, I think in my original video, I didn't have the text facing the other way, right? So the mirror text you see here right now, I think in my original video, I didn't have that. Right, but at least not at this point in time, but later on when the camera turns around and everything all of a sudden was mirrored. So with the positions I had here 1 to 6, at least there are always a few words that you can read at any point in time, pretty much at least. But as I said, work on this and do it to your own liking. It may take a bit of time, but as you get used to it, it will go faster and faster. Right, so let's move on to the next bit and let's start rendering it out, do a few tweaks on the look and feel, and then we call today. So let's go there. Now we'll start by adding a renderer 3D. And I will display that in viewport 2. And I want to get rid of that checkered background in the options there. Untick that, and then I'll change the renderer type to OpenGL renderer to make it a bit more nippy. And the transparency I want to set to accurate to get things properly. Now, before I'll enable the accumulation effects, I want to have a look at the merge 3D. Right, so let's display that and actually let's set it to perspective, because what we want to do is ensure that we get the camera settings right. And I'm just trying to look for my camera there. And there we go, I can see it there. And what I want to do is basically show the focal plane. So I need to actually show that there, and I'll increase the subdivisions just to see where I am right now, or where the plane is. And you can see it's right there at the end. So one will want to bring that a lot closer to the camera, because that's basically what the camera will focus on. And right now, with the depth of field being infinite, doesn't matter. But once we enable it and set it to something smaller, it will become important. So I'm setting it to something close to the camera, something like 0.5. And then when I enable this, and it takes a bit to calculate on my computer, and the quality is set to 32 for now, but the depth of field blur, I really lower that a lot. And then the quality of my computer, for now, I'll set it to 10. For the final render, you probably want to increase it a bit. But in my video, actually 10 was what I used in the example video. I'm dialing it down a bit more to 0.002. And that's enough for now. Right? You can of course make it a lot more extreme if you want to, but for my purposes that works just fine. Now let's add a soft glow node, one of my all-time favorites, and display that. But before I actually go there, I want to add in another node, an alpha multiply, after the renderer 3D. So let's add it in first. And you can see already it alters the look a bit. So let's display that. And if I switch it off and on, you see a subtle difference. What basically happens is that in the P custom, of course, we were altering our alpha channel with that formula, the noise 2 based formula. Now, if I display the renderer 3D in viewport 1 and look at the channel values, red, green and blue at the bottom, they're substantially higher compared to the one on the right, where I display the alpha multiply. That's basically because we multiply the channels by the alpha, so it becomes lower because the alpha is lower than 1. So let's go back to our soft glow and increase the threshold a bit, because as I said, it was way over the top. So I reduce the gain a bit as well, play around with the glow size until I get something I like. Something like this. And then finally, I'm going to add a color corrector, and then we can apply some correction to the whole thing, should we want to. Again, this is all to your own liking. Well, the whole thing is, of course. Now, the very last thing, of course, would be to add a saver to save it out, but I won't go into that. Whilst I said finally, there's one other thing I wanted to touch upon, and that is really the scenario where really you want to have some specific text at a specific point in time. Of course, you can try to navigate your camera around to that point, but it's all a bit random. Right? So what I can do though is copy over some of the text up to but excluding the color corrector, and in the text let's remove that expression and let's type in some text, and let's call this special text. Right? And then we can increase the size a bit because it's special text. And then after that, I want to apply a color corrector. And I didn't want to take the original one because it had sort of the modifier applied and such. So I just want to set it to a certain color. And now what I'll do is basically pipe it into an image plane. And now basically we've got something that looks exactly like the particles, but it's an image plane which we can basically position wherever we want. Right? Now it's of course massive right now, but in a way it's nice because we can see what we're doing. And now we can just position, rotate the text around any way we see fit. Right? Like for instance, if we rotate it around on the y-axis, -90, and then it's sort of in front of the camera. Let's have a look at the camera there. Maybe we need to have a look at the camera itself, the viewpoint. I can't quite see it. Right, so I'll probably need to move it around a bit. Now I'll move the merge node, but I want to actually move the image plane and scale it down a bit, move it around. Doesn't really matter for now. It's now just for illustration purposes. Right, so we can leave it for now, but as you can see, it's a way to get a specific text in front of the camera at a specific point in time. So this is a great way of combining specific strings of text you want to show at specific points in time with the overall cloud, right? If you would want to recreate a whole cloud with image planes, you can do it, of course, but it would mean an awful lot of work. And well, maybe you're less lazy than I am and you would go down that route, but I don't want to go down that route. So I think it's a nice hybrid type thing. In any case, that was it for this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you've got any questions, of course, as per always, leave your comments below. See you next time. Take care and stay healthy. Bye-bye.